Well, hey, let's jump in. Welcome everybody. Welcome to New Year. Happy Friday. First Friday conversation of 2021. And so we're excited to jump in. Man, whether you're listening live on Facebook, the recording on our back end, YouTube, whatever, I want to welcome you to our Friday conversation. Hey, we want to take just a minute today and just talk about why we do Friday conversations. Ben and I started this, I don't know, around COVID time, right? We started
Yeah,
rolling
it's
out Friday conversations
early
sometime
last spring.
March. Yeah. One of the things that we found was, man, as we were talking to leaders, coaching leaders, in conversations, man, we would just sometimes see certain topics or ideas or
hmm
questions or kind of threads of things where it gave us an opportunity to kind of say, hey, what if we created space, casual space, to just jump in and talk about some of these different things. And so sometimes it's Ben and I will jump on a Friday conversation. A lot of times we even today or this week we mapped out some different people to kind of invite them into the conversation about certain topics. Hopefully
Yeah.
these topics will be relevant and they'll hit maybe for many of you kind of something about your ministry, what's going on. So whether you're watching this live on Facebook, we'll try to do it around 1:30 Central almost every Friday, so you can jump in with us, or you can catch the recording on YouTube or our Facebook group as well. So there you go, Ben. You want to jump in, kind of share
Yeah,
or
yeah.
kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about today?
Yeah. So first Friday conversation, like Andy said, of 2021. So we thought we'd take a moment and just kind of reflect on a ministry and personal level things that both Andy and I have learned or that we learned from 2021 with or from 2020, and how are we going to put that into action in 2021. We talked with lots of leaders, throughout the end of last year, and it was a struggle for a lot of people. And I think there's a lot through struggle is where a lot of those lessons are learned. Um, but before we talk about, I think both Andy and I will share three things that we learned through last year, some personal stuff, some ministry application kind of stuff. But before we do that, I would love, we can just talk a minute or two about how was 2020 for you, Andy, for Elementum overall.
Yeah, it was interesting because I was pretty when I went into 2020, I was super excited about where things were at. I remember we were in the Portland, Vancouver, in the Northwest area,
Yeah.
Washington, and coming out of meetings, just really excited about 2020. And then obviously COVID hit, and there was a lot of question marks, I think, for us.
Mhm.
And so I think on a ministry level, it's been really interesting to see just as much engagement, just as much desire to figure things out. And so we've continued to grow, which has been really fun. On a ministry level, personally, I would say it's been hard. We were even talking about this on group coaching call over the last couple of weeks with some different groups of just things we learned. And man, it's just being isolated has been hard. I think, doing things virtually has been hard, lots of screen time. I think for me personally, our family, we have seniors, and this was never the ideal senior
Yeah.
year like my kids were imagining. And so we're helping them have to navigate that on a personal level as well. So it's been kind of weird on a personal level. I think it's been hard on a ministry level. I feel like that there hasn't still kind of continued to push forward.
Yeah, I think I'd say it's similar on our end. The year overall, on like a family level, things went really. It was actually a really good year. We had some great opportunities to connect. That extra time, thanks to COVID, where we spent extra time with family. We were actually able to take a sabbatical there at the end of summer, which was really refreshing. But then on a local ministry level, is really a struggle. Just people feeling really stuck or kind of overwhelmed by all the stuff that's going on with COVID and other various, life chaos kind of things. So we're really going into 2021 on a local level. We're kind of like, man, is this ministry that we've been leading here in Fargo for the last 10 years? Is this thing going to last, or is it time to put an end to it? Um, but then on the Elementum side of things, it feels like aside from missing some of the fun in-person stuff and getting to visit some of the leaders that we love, talk to them face to face rather than just digitally. It's been amazing to see the increase in passion and like urgency to reach the next generation, which is a pretty exciting thing from our perspective.
Yeah, which has been really crazy because, and you've heard this a bunch of time on different calls of, people who almost ashamedly have to say, man, 2020 was really good as a ministry, or whatever, or as a
Mm-hmm.
family or whatever. And so it's been interesting even hearing that from people of saying, hey, we're engaging the campus more than ever, or our team is healthier than ever, our family is healthier than ever. It's been really interesting dynamics, even listening to people.
Yeah. Well, why don't you? I think that kind of flows into one of the things that you'd mentioned that were one of your kind of key learnings from last year. So why don't you go ahead
Yeah.
and share your three?
Just do all three of them, you think, or?
Yeah, might as well.
Yeah. Okay. Well, here's the three things as Ben and I talked about this and doing some reflection over the last kind of couple days, knowing that we're coming into this Friday conversation. I think one of the things of that, man, I would say on kind of on a ministry level is that, man, it's been so interesting to see how much we've learned about our ministries. And the way that I keep kind of describing it to leaders is our foundations were exposed in a pretty dramatic way in 2020. The strength of our leadership, our commitment to community, the quality of our disciple making, our belief in the mission, like all of
Mm-hmm.
those things. And so I think in a lot of ways, what it did is it shined a huge light on the strengths and the weaknesses. And the question I kind of keep coming back to is like, okay, what are we going to do with that data and that information? And that's where I keep kind of pushing leaders towards in what we've learned
Yeah.
in 2020 of saying, okay, what are you going to do about it? Now that your leadership team is weak, or that discipleship isn't as strong as you thought it was, or whatever the kind of the instance is. Now, what do we do with that data as we begin to move forward? So I would say on a ministry level, that's a huge thing. Secondly, and you said this, Ben, and so I remember in this group coaching call, you talked about sometimes there's seasons of pruning that we never talk about within kind of our church culture, that God takes us through individually, collectively, as a ministry, as a church, or individually, that there are seasons of pruning. And if you look at like that John chapter 15, the intent of that pruning, one is it's motivated by love of God, because there's this desire in the branches to be more fruitful, to produce more fruit, right? So it's
Mm-hmm.
not like, but it's interesting as I reflected personally, even, or within ministries, I began to ask the question after you said that. I think it was like a November group coaching call or something like that. I began to ask kind of some leaders of, say, what if 2020 was a year of pruning for us individually? And what if we look back, in 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, and say, wow, I needed kind of this
Oh,
season
yeah.
of pruning that God needed to do in our churches, in our ministry, in me personally as a leader, or as a father, or as a husband. And so I've been really like thinking about that over the last couple months of saying, how do I, because I think that our culture is like, we try to avoid pain, that like
Yeah.
that's kind of naturally in us. And so how do you kind of embrace that even season of God maybe doing that, moving into that? And so
Good.
that's the
Just
second thing.
a thought on that. I think there really is a pressure, um, and I don't know if it comes from corporate America and that influence in the world, but there is a significant pressure that like if you're really following God, the movement's always going to be up and to the right. We're always going to
Yeah.
see more people come to faith. We're always going to see more people come to the ministry. We're always going to see more disciples made. When really, I think the primary that's a more like of a mechanistic view of things. When the more primary models or illustrations that Jesus uses are organic, agricultural, and you look like I can look outside my window here in North Dakota, and there is not much growing right now. It's 30 degrees, which is relatively warm for this time of year, but there is all the plants are at best existing and not dying. But there's value in that. And you see plants here, as soon as it starts warming up, come March, April, May, like they're going to grow like crazy. I think that really is for a lot of people. I mean, I think some of the stuff I'll share, I think that's really been the season that I've been in personally and on a local level ministry wise too, is that
Yeah.
pruning that's led to a lot of learning that's gonna lead to a lot of growth.
Yeah. And we just don't talk about it. We don't set the stage as that a possibility of God doing that, and
Mm-hmm.
even kind of leaning into that a little bit. So that's good. Yeah. My third one is, man, online is not enough. It is just like I love online. I love the advantage that we have of digital, and for us at Elementum, I mean, we can jump on calls with leaders all over the country, all over the world. We can grab people together like that we can't. But it's been interesting because I feel like that what it's shown, even we had talk about a question of what we had learned about ourselves in a group coaching call in 2020. And I learned about myself is I'm an introvert, but even as an introvert, I still need relationships. And when it's a screen is good, but it does not replace the value. And we've even talked about that even on a ministry level of like how often do we need to get together because there's kind of this thing that's missing. And it's so fun to see church online, but then there's this reality of like, man, you get 6 weeks into doing that, 8 weeks into doing that, and you're like, we're not meant to do this. This is not sustainable long term. And that was a kind of a big aha for me. And I think what I hope to see is that we figure out the balance or the sweet spot in that. Because I think for a lot of even churches, it pushed them to like get into the digital age and to begin to figure out that that is a tool in which people can use. But I think that there needs to be a balance in that of saying when is those times that an online is a good space, digital is a good space, but where does it need to be also
Yeah,
the arm of in person as well?
yeah, for sure. I mean, we just this Wednesday we finished reading the chapter. Our staff is reading through the Forgotten Ways, and I was really struck by the chapter we read and discussed this Wednesday, which was on the incarnation or the missional incarnational impulse. Which plug for the book if you've never read the Forgotten Ways by Alan Hirsch. Do it. It's not an easy read, but it's well worth working your way through. But one of the primary points he's making in that chapter is that if God's primary way of reaching, ministering to, showing himself to the world was through the incarnation, the physical embodiment of himself in Christ, um, then that needs to shape how we minister to people, which I think was it was a good affirmation for me. Just a good reminder, like, yeah, we need to prioritize that in-person stuff. It's the online is a stopgap. Maybe it's beneficial in places where the in-person is not possible. But it's not the same thing.
Yeah. How about
Um,
you, Ben? I'd love to hear what are a couple things that you learned in 2020.
yeah. Um, I think one of the biggest things just taken away from that is that, like, just looking at some of the people that I'm ministering to locally and the number of different places that people are at, people who I thought were really solid spiritually and growing, just in some ways have crashed and burned. I mean, not crashed and burned, but stalled out or gotten lost. People who I thought were in really bad places or was like, man, I don't know if how this is gonna go for them. It's really been the opposite. I've seen some of those people grow really significantly, and overcome significant obstacles. So one of the key takeaways for me in that is that, like, man, if we don't have our identity grounded in Christ, we're not going to be able to navigate the circumstances around us. It's one thing to kind of skate by on your own power, when circumstances are well, when you're familiar with the territory that you're navigating, when the people are cooperating, whatever. But if we are going to, I think, thrive and grow in the environment that it seems like we're moving into, COVID, Lord willing, vaccinations and stuff will minimize some of that. But I feel like that we're not going back to 2019. We're not going back to even 2016. In the cultural attitude towards Christianity continues to darken. So I think we're going to continue. COVID may go away, but the circumstances I don't think are going to get better for people who are in like a purely like worldly sense, for people who are trying to lead ministries and follow Jesus. So we need to be grounded in who we are in Christ. Second thing that I really saw the value of was that slowing down is well worth the
Yeah.
for someone like me, well worth the frustration or the like tension that comes with that. There was a lot of times towards the end of 2020 where I was like, I would get done with work like 2 hours earlier than planned and be like, well, I mean, there's other stuff I could do, but I feel like that's not stuff that really has to be done. But I would feel bad, spending an extra hour or two on some level, feel like this kind of angst in my soul, like, I should be doing more work. There's more that needs to get done. But there wasn't really. It was just that there wasn't as much stuff going on because of COVID. But being gracious to myself and to even the people around us when there's challenging circumstances and saying, hey, let's pace ourselves. It's like thinking about if you're going to pace yourself significantly differently if you're running up a mountain than you are if you're running across a wide open prairie. And so it's foolish and detrimental to have the expectation that if you're running an unfamiliar terrain, through an unknown mountain range, like I think metaphorically we have been in leading ministry for the last year-ish, several months. We have to say, we got to acknowledge the pace. We need to set an appropriate pace for the terrain that we're in. Then the last thing, I think this has been maybe even more in the last 2 or 3 weeks, but even the end of 2020, just seeing the importance of leading like Jesus does. And I think a lot of times we look to the we have a picture of Jesus leading, which is like, I think tends to look more like post crucifixion Jesus, or the second coming Jesus. He's coming back with power, and he's going to punch Satan in the face and take over the world. When I think the more biblical picture of what leadership looks like in the current moment and just the political reality of all that's going on in the last several months has, I think, called this out as even more important for me, is that like we need to ask ourselves, what does it look like to follow Jesus' model of being the suffering servant rather than the like problem solving superhero when we're leaders? What does it look like to have humble, quiet obedience without needing to flaunt it on the internet or be celebrated or even fix other people's problems, because ultimately that's not something we can do. That's something that God is going to do in and through them. But the temptation is to use our own power and try to solve people's problems and be the superhero rather than the suffering servant.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think those are kind of my three of my key things that I'm moving into the new year with.
It's good. It's interesting how I think there's a certain practice that we don't do well of reflection. Like even we did a webinar, Ben and I, talking about preparation of the
Mm-hmm.
new year and just kind of moving into being proactive and strategic about new year. But I think a part of that too is that I think that there's, how do you mine out of the learning, of, and I think so often that we too quickly move off of our current season without trying to mine out or extract the nuggets of learning that
Yeah.
are there. And so, I think that even some of these questions, and I would encourage anybody listening, man, if you haven't done a reflection yet off 2020, um, it's worth taking 2-3 hours, pull a journal out. What did God teach you? What did you learn? What were some kind of obstacles and wins, and kind of celebrate through some of that stuff.
Yeah, great little tool to help you do that. And we mentioned this in that webinar. But is go like scroll back through your camera roll if you have a
Mhm.
smartphone, or go on Instagram if you're on social media. And because I think that's a great way of looking at some of those photos. For me, I did this New Year's Day, uh, and took about 2 hours just to kind of reflect back on the last year. And it was amazing. I was actually like, man, we actually had a lot of fun moments in 2020. Even though my general kind of look at it at that moment was a little bit more frustrated and down, I actually left that time being like, actually, there was a lot of good things that came out of that for us as a family, for me individually. So
That's great.
maybe one last question before we wrap up is, what of those things that you learned, what does it look like to put some of that stuff into, integrate that into life here in this new year?
Um, I think it's I want to be better at embracing the difficulty. Whether it was, even my point about the foundations of exposing, or if it's the pruning, like I want to be better at, like, kind of even what I just talked about is extracting those moments. And so I want to grow in that area, as a leader, to kind of really begin to evaluate, to assess, to ask the question, what is God doing? What is he teaching me? And then to begin to create some pathways moving forward. Me personally, I just move off of things too quickly. And so I would say I want to I want to be better at that, looking at some of those things that God, in the reflections of what God was doing in 2020, and do that in a better way. How about you?
I mean, practically, this is actually something I started doing end of last year with a group of 3 or 4 people, but I'm going to continue it into probably at least through the midpoint of this year. Is taking 10 to 15 minutes each day, 4 to 5 days a week. Don't do it on the weekends because schedules are different then, but just to have space for, similar to what you're saying, reflective prayer, kind of meditative prayer, whatever you want to call it, just making space for really pressing into prayer, because so many of the things, I mean, this is the thing with, right, Jesus being the suffering servant. I've been reading through Isaiah recently. Like, the only way that you can embrace that role is if you really trust that God is the one who is going to solve, or in the case of like the suffering servant, one of the passages in Isaiah is like, he didn't try to justify himself. He didn't try to defend himself. Instead, he entrusts himself to him who judges justly.
Yeah.
So I think on a practical way, that I think taking that space, making that space in my day-to-day life has been really helpful in being like, all right, God, I'm going to start my day with 15 minutes of inactivity, like intentional inactivity, but inactivity. Even on the days where it's like, oh man, I'm 15 minutes behind, 20 minutes behind, I got to get started. And instead be like, nope, we're going to entrust that to you, God. If my schedule's behind, or if people I would love to see grow in certain places are not growing in those places. Yeah, and it's been thus far the practice. It's been super refreshing and encouraging, and just some sweet time with Jesus. So, plan is to keep that
Awesome.
going.
Awesome. So here's what I'd love to do as we close. Man, if you're watching this, rewatching this, I would love for you to post in the comments, like,
Mm-hmm.
what's something that you learned in 2020, and we'd love to
Yeah.
hear just some of your reflections, some of your thoughts as you begin to move forward. So, well, it was fun to jump back into Friday conversations here, Ben. Any last minute comments before we sign off for today?
2020 is going to be good, even if it isn't.
You mean 2021 is going to be good?
That too. I don't even know. I don't even know when
I
we are
know what
anymore.
year it is.
Yeah.
Sounds good. Awesome. Well, have a good weekend, everybody, or day whenever you're listening to this. We'll catch you on another conversation coming up.